Dr. Thelma Lavine, Professor of Philosophy at George Mason University. Why is the Declaration of Independence such a special document?
It's a special document because for our country, it establishes the fundamental concept of freedom. And it does so not only for our country, but it makes this a universal concept for all human beings.
If you were to touch on what the fundamental concepts were which formed the political philosophy behind the Declaration, what 2 or 3 concepts drove that document?
The Declaration of Independence came from primarily the British philosophy that developed primarily with John Locke. He began to write on this in 1664. By 1689, he had finished his second treatise of civil government, and that contained the principles that fed in to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all the other people who were involved in developing these ideas for this country.
Okay, we're going to get some more into those ideas, but in the meantime, welcome to our program. Our special guest during this hour on the eve of July 4th is Dr. Thelma Lavine, who is Robinson University Professor in Philosophy and the Humanities at Virginia's George Mason University. She is also the former chair of the Department of Philosophy at George Washington University. We'll be telling you some more about her and some more about the subject matter, but in the meantime, let me tell you what we want to do during this hour. As always, we encourage your participation, and we will open the phones in just about 5 to 10 minutes. But tonight we like to talk specifically about the Declaration of Independence. With all of the hoopla and the barbecuing and all that, we don't often get a chance to talk specifically what is the document that is driving the political philosophy behind this country. So we're going to give you a chance to comment on that and to ask questions of someone who has spent a lot of time thinking and writing about it. So if you live in the Eastern or the Central time zones and want to participate, call 202-628-2525. If you live further out west, the number to call is 202-783-2727, and we will start taking calls in about 5 to 10 minutes, so you can start dialing now. One pointer, if you get a ringing sound, that means you've gotten through to one of our lines, but we won't pick it up till we're ready to put you on the air so we can keep your phone costs down. So we'll start taking calls in just a few minutes. Let's go back to the Declaration and cover some of the basics here. Why was the Declaration written? What happened that caused some men, and I assume they were all men, in a room July 4th, 1776 to sign the Declaration of Independence?
What caused them to do this was a long developmental series of disputes with England and with Parliament, with the King, George III. And this had to do with the way in which England was handling the colonies, these American colonies. England had become very complacent since its own revolution of 1688, the Glorious Revolution. And after the Glorious Revolution, England had the feeling that nothing could be better than what already existed in England, and it didn't pay very much attention to reforms, improvements. It wasn't watching its relationship with the colonies, and so for a long time it didn't pay any attention to the colonies. But after a while it began to seem that the colonies were going to be a rich source of profit to Great Britain through tobacco and sugar and other products, and so they began to put the squeeze on this country, and this began to irritate the colonists quite a bit. And yet there was no great burning issue that you would think would finally have produced a declaration of separation and independence from England. And so it's always been a kind of mystery as to why this happened at all, because it was not a revolution in the ordinary sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let's separate two issues here. Okay. You talked about economics for a moment there, about the great wealth that the motherland could extract from the colonies. Right. If you were to separate two issues, on one hand say this is really an economic issue, you know, we all learned in school taxation without representation. This was an economic issue with an economic motivation, and then take the idea that there was a very pure spiritual ideal that a group of political philosophers wanted to create a nation based on these spiritual ideals. Which of these two, or did both, generate the signing of that document?
That's a very good point. What you call the spiritual, the realm of ideas, the concept of independence, that took preeminence by far over the economic. The economic issues could have been worked out. But what became clearer and clearer to the colonies was that they were, in fact, an independent people. That, in fact, they were acting independently of the Crown, independently of Parliament. They began to see themselves 3,000 miles away as acting by themselves in freedom. And so suddenly, there came a kind of mind switch in which they no longer saw themselves as colonials, they saw themselves as an independent people. And that is how the Declaration begins. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to declare its independence of another. And this is what they were doing. It is very similar to the concept of a child reaching a stage of maturity in which it declares its independence. Because England was, after all, the mother country. We were not rebelling or in revolution against her ideas. Her ideas were our ideas and have remained so.
Okay, we will get back to some of those ideas in just a few minutes. I must tell you we have several open lines in the West Coast, 202-783-2727. But first we go to St. Louis, Missouri. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you doing tonight?
I'm fine. How are you? What does the Declaration of Independence mean to you?
Well, I'll tell you something. It's probably my favorite of all documents ever written besides the Bible itself. And I would like to read from one passage of the Declaration of Independence.
As long as you keep it short, go right ahead.
It's very short, and it's probably the heart of the Declaration itself. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The main point I like to make on this is that the Supreme Court over the years has deemed this inappropriate to be taught in public schools, that we have a Creator God who created us, and that our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness come from this Creator God.
Okay.
And I believe it's judicial activism plus a misinterpretation of the First Amendment that has prevented school children such as myself from being taught this principle in public school.
Okay, thank you, St. Louis. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. I think that the relationship of the fundamental concepts of this country, especially at the founding of the country, were intertwined with religious concepts. And I think the point you're making is absolutely right. What in fact, of course, has happened, which has influenced the Supreme Court, is that as we have become increasingly a pluralistic society, which we were not at the founding, we were a Protestant society at the founding. As we've become increasingly a pluralistic society, there has been a concern not to emphasize religion at all, so that total religious freedom and total religious pluralism would be the American way.
If we had that sort of religious pluralism in 1776, would references to the Creator been not in the Declaration of Independence?
Probably not, except that I suppose at the time of the founding, that this country would not have had people within it whose religious beliefs, such as Buddhism, would not have included a creator of any kind. Insofar as we're talking about the Judeo-Christian types of religions, then they would all have no problem with the creator.
Next call comes from Herndon, Virginia. Good evening. You're on the air.
Good evening. To me, the Declaration of Independence has always, I hoped, been some sort of a declaration of the promise of the New World, fulfillment of the promise of the New World. And the New World to Europeans seemed to mean freedom from the mistakes that Western civilization had made up to that point. Totalitarianism, wars, mass destruction. And in a large sense, this country has failed to fulfill that promise because we've become immersed in many of the same political and cultural problems that Europeans have repeated before us. My concerns in 1986 are how we fulfill that promise, and how far human condition we have to reach, to what sort of dream we have to express for this planet. My concerns today are that we're failing rather significantly to fulfill the promise that our forefathers so valiantly and bravely expressed. I wonder how we get there from here.
Okay. Are we fulfilling the political ideals that were inherent in the Declaration?
I think we're striving valiantly to do that. As you may have noticed in the last couple of weeks, the Supreme Court has moved 180 degrees around from one position to another. And this is because of the enormous complexity of the problems that a mass society faces. I think that the founders had, in fact, a very dim view of what had been going on in Europe throughout its history, and very happy to be free from that. But as we have ourselves become a mass society, and probably the most polyglot society in the world, the most pluralistic in every possible sense, the problems have gone beyond what was conceivable to the imagination of the founders. I think we're struggling, and I don't think we're losing the struggle. I hope not.
Next call comes from Knoxville, Tennessee. Good evening.
Good evening. I would like to know if she believes that a reference to blaming King George for foisting the slave trade off on the colonies was originally in the Declaration, but later stricken, perhaps to get the South to join the revolt. And also if she believes that the basic principles of the Declaration, or at least some of them, were abandoned at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, as scholars like James J. Smith say, in what they call somewhat of an aristocratic counter-revolution.
Thank you very much.
Well, with regard to the first question, that is so controversial and so difficult to arrive at any kind of assured answer that I really can't speak to that. It presents an interesting problem, which is all that I really could say about that. With regard to the second question, namely the aristocratic coloration of the Constitution, I think that notion began to be talked about at the time of the progressive movement, as you know, in this country, in the pre-World War I decades. And of course, Charles Beard, in his economic interpretation of the Constitution, was riding that hobby horse very, very high. I think, however, that according to most of the scholars who make colonial history and the constitutional period their area, that the notion that there was some kind of aristocratic or grand bourgeois effort to manipulate the Constitution to produce desirable results for them, that has been exploded. No one seems to believe that anymore. That is, the evidence has not come in. There was no oppressed class that in Marxist language would be called a proletariat. There was no merchant class that was seeking to keep them within bounds. The notion of some kind of residual aristocracy doesn't seem to have, again, any evidence for it.
Quick follow-up to Knoxville's question. Was the issue of slavery a hot issue during the debate over the wording of the Declaration?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge, even though, of course, it surely was something that could have been expected to be in Jefferson's mind.
Next call comes from Matawan, New Jersey. Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. I'd like to know, is the arms going to get any stricter in the future about the rights to bear arms? I don't really...
Not quite sure we understand your question. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the arms, like I hunt, and it's getting really strict to own a gun. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, any reaction to that at all?
Well, I don't think the Declaration of Independence would be the definitive document that would be decisive with regard to that. This would have to come back ultimately to the Constitution, but more specifically to state laws and regulations.
In the century before 1776, what were the key political thinkers and political events that influenced the writers of the Declaration?
The key events that influenced them really were from 1763 on. From 1763 on, there came the squeeze from the British. The Stamp Act, the Boston Port Act, these were the flagrant examples of unfairness on the part of Britain with regard to the colonies.
Were there other things happening in Europe in the decades before that created a revolutionary spirit that encouraged the drafters of the Declaration?
Of course, because what was happening in Europe was the thinking of that is generally called the Enlightenment, and these are the thinkers who were part of that vast movement that was striking for freedom all across Europe. And this began in England. In England, the Glorious Revolution was already in 1688, in which the middle class, who were changing the map of Europe as well as of England, they achieved sufficient economic power to strike for political power. And they had on their behalf the religious ideas of the Puritan Revolution in England, and soon after the political ideas of John Locke. And then it was this development that inspired the American Revolution of 1776, and it was the American Revolution of 1776 that inspired the French Revolution of 1789. And these were the three great so-called Enlightenment revolutions. They were the revolutions of the Enlightenment era, which usually is said to be from 1650 to the end of the 18th century.
Next call for Thelma Lavine comes from Phoenix, Arizona. Good evening, Phoenix.
Hello. I'd like to ask the lady, considering the Supreme Court's ruling this past week on homosexuals being able to be put into prison for loving one another, does she think that somewhat, unfortunately, puts a sham on the pretense of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it goes back to this very vague concept of the pursuit of happiness. What is included in that? If I pursue my own happiness in ways that run afoul of a particular law, for example, if I pursue my happiness by way of taking from someone a piece of property that will bring me pleasure, that pursuit of happiness is denied to me, and no one would question that. I think that if my pursuit of happiness takes the form of being the second additional wife of a man in a bigamous relationship, and we're all happy, everyone is consenting to this, that pursuit of happiness, again, is denied to me by the law. And so we come back to the issue that you raise. Is the pursuit of happiness without any limits or boundaries? Is that my right? I don't think that the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence intended that the pursuit of happiness, however it pleases me, is my right, and that right is guaranteed to me by the Constitution.
Again, Dr. Thelma Lavine is Robinson University professor in philosophy and the humanities at George Mason University. Before that, with George Washington University, is the author of a book called From Socrates to Sartre, The Philosophical Quest. Has written articles for the Washington Post magazine, the Washington Post, the Washingtonian magazine. Is co-author of Naturalism and the Human Spirit, and is currently engaged in a study of changes in 20th century American culture. Has a degree from Radcliffe College and a doctorate in philosophy and psychology from Harvard. Was a Radcliffe Research Fellow. You also worked on a PBS series, which actually is the same as the book, From Socrates to Sartre. What was that all about?
Well, I was asked to do a series on philosophy that would be part of the educational program of two PBS networks. And in fact, this was the way it was constructed. It was constructed in 30 scripts that ran for 15 weeks and that constituted a college course. And so people could actually take this course, can actually take this course for college credit. Of course, most of the viewers were people who were just enjoying themselves.
In an age when more and more people go to study business instead of philosophy, do you think that philosophy and the study of philosophy is still much desired by students on American campuses?
I think it is probably more than ever, because I think that with the kind of interest in professionalization of one's career, oneself while in college and one's later career, that there develops a kind of impoverishment of one's cultural and spiritual life. And I think that we see this all around us, that people are hungry for some kind of insight into themselves, for some kind of insight into what is going on in the world. And by that insight, they don't mean the latest news flash. They mean understanding. They mean piercing the veil of all the razzmatazz that they hear constantly on the mass media.
Next call comes from Austin, Texas. Good evening, you're on the air.
Hi, I have just joined your program and haven't heard any earlier questions, but my question involves a very glaring aspect of the Declaration of Independence. That is the phrase that deals with all men were created equal with certain inalienable rights. Were black American citizens contemplated to be within this? And if so, how was slavery justified? And if not, why were they not intended to be included in that?
Well, actually, we did briefly touch on the issue of slavery, but let's go to that issue. How could they justify that phrase of all men being created equal and yet treat blacks so unfairly?
Right. The slavery was, in parts of the colonies, already beginning to be a very profitable operation. And in order to maintain slavery, there had to be some kind of fiction that slaves were not fully human. And this was, of course, how finally the Constitution decided the matter. But what is interesting about the Declaration of Independence is that it does declare that all men are created equal, although it does use the word men. And thus, not only are blacks in principle included in that category, but also women in principle are included in the category of mankind. And eventually, both blacks and women were able to appeal on the ground that our own founding document, namely the Declaration of Independence, says all men are created equal. And thus the rhetoric turns out to be not merely rhetoric, it turns out to be the foundation for the correcting of great injustices.
Next call comes from Laredo, Texas. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm fine today. How are you, Laredo?
Fine, and let me say that I really enjoyed your guest tonight. She's a very knowledgeable woman. It's a pleasure to listen to her. I had a question about the Constitution. Now, it's been 50 years since I've studied government, but if I remember the Constitution, it spelled out the powers of the federal government to protect us from our enemies. And here last week, the federal government threatened to withhold the highway taxes from the state, I believe it was Arizona or Nevada, when they had collected the taxes there. That worried me. I wonder if our forefathers who wrote the Constitution, would they be alarmed at the action of the federal government?
Thanks for the call.
Well, I would guess I don't know the case that you're talking about, but from what you have just said, it would seem to me that our forefathers at the time of the revolutionary activity in this country would have been very upset with what you're talking about. It would be very close to what they call taxation without representation.
Next call comes from San Francisco, California. Good evening.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question for the doctor. I'd like her to clarify a previous question that was asked about homosexuality. With the latest ruling from the Supreme Court, I'm wondering if you would consider the right for homosexuals to do what we'd like to do consentingly in our own homes. I wonder if you would consider that a right that should be protected.
I think that that it's in a very fundamental sense. Of course, it should be protected. The question, of course, is the question of rights. And as you know, the opinion that was written by Justice White was one that said we cannot be simply adding rights of various kinds as events seem to demand them to the Constitution. And so it would seem to me that that a wiser judicial decision would have found a way of not getting involved in that very difficult issue that is not only one of rhetoric but one of legality, and have asserted that the behavior of people in their private and personal lives should not be the concern of government, without having gotten itself bogged down in the question of adding new rights to the Constitution.
Seven Pines, North Carolina. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Okay, my question, as far as equal rights and equal representation, I see a problem as far as the education aspect is concerned. It doesn't seem as though everyone is treated fairly from the education standpoint as far as equal rights, and also that those, I feel partly, I for one feel that I could do teaching, and I'm finding that it's very difficult to get employment for the simple reason there seems to be some rhetoric that there are certain standards that one must, and I have found through doing tutoring of my own that what the problem really lies in is not so much standards as that one must pass a certification, but the problem in the classroom are methods. And I feel that my methods, I have found through testing that my methods are, in some cases, such as in math, are better than others, and I feel that I should be given a chance, to prove myself.
Okay, thanks for the call, Seven Pines. We have another caller standing by from Berkeley, California. Go ahead, please. Berkeley, California, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to ask her how long slaves contributed to the economy of the Western world. And when they talk about the affirmative action decision that was just reached, and they talked about past injustices, did the people understand the economics that the blacks contributed that they were not allowed to participate in? And how does she see affirmative action helping those past injustices, if in fact it will?
Well, I think that we have quite a bit of information now with regard to the ways in which blacks did contribute to the economy. There have been some marvelous studies that have been aided by computer methodology showing showing with regard to the blacks on a given plantation how much work they produced, how much it cost to feed and clothe and house them, and these were marvelous capital investments on the part of the plantation system. And so we know very, very much about how much they contribute to the economy. As for the way in which affirmative action can make up for that, I think that that one can only hope that the recent Supreme Court decision will spur on the impetus of affirmative action, not only for blacks but also for women.
Let's talk about Marxism for a moment. If you were to look at American political philosophy, and of course there's different opinions on what exactly that is, and if you look at Marxist political philosophy, what are the fundamental differences in the worldview and in the view of the state and its citizens, issues like freedom, between those two? I mean, I know you can speak for several hours on that, but what are the main differences in how they look at the world?
The main difference is that from our point of view, that is from a Western liberal democratic point of view, the way in which we perceive the world is in terms of the universality of freedom, the universality of equality, the universality of certain rights that are unalienable. This is the main way in which human life is perceived in principled terms. By contrast, very differently, the Marxian view views the world and human life primarily in historical terms and in terms of conflict. Marxism is primarily a conflict theory, viewing viewing human life historically as a series of conflicts between always a dominant and an oppressed class. And thus, what Marxism offers is a view of you as a member of your class as either guilty as part of the dominant class, or else suffering and oppressed as part of the dominated class. And what Marxism offers to the dominated class is a legitimation for rising up in a revolution, to strip the dominant class of its power and possessions and to change the world. And so it is an activist philosophy, it is an historical philosophy, and primarily it is a philosophy of conflict.
If you're interested, by the way, in the issues of affirmative action and other civil rights issues, C-SPAN this week is covering the 77th Annual Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. We have shown speeches by Senator Gary Hart and Senator Joseph Biden, both Democrats who are considered potential presidential candidates. Immediately following this program, we'll show a luncheon speech at which Vice President George Bush, another potential presidential candidate, recently spoke. So that's right after this program, 10:30 Eastern Time. In the meantime, we have a caller standing by from Nashua, New Hampshire. Good evening.
Good evening. Dr. Lavine, it's good to see you again. I was a student of yours at George Washington University about 15 years ago when I was in graduate school.
Very good. Very glad to hear from you.
Yes. Well, and I just wanted you to know, talking about philosophy and the use of philosophy, it was a long time percolating in me, but talk about cutting through the veil. I am going to be entering Harvard Divinity School in the fall. And I think it is somewhat important, especially in this modern day, that we do look at some eternal verities, which I think that the Declaration of Independence is an example.
Nashua, do you think that we've lost that in this culture, that the spiritual ideals represented in the Declaration have been lost in this society?
Well, I think it's always talk about eternal verities. I think once you state the ideal and start putting it into practice, you move away from the ideal. I think the example, the image of the Statue of Liberty being shrouded in a scaffolding, I think is somewhat appropriate in light of how we view immigrants in this country right now, and the political nature of the implementation of immigration policy. And I think that we have, very surprisingly, in regard to the recent Supreme Court decision on homosexuals, and the real, an extraordinary, especially for what seems to be an increasingly conservative court, an extraordinary intrusion into the personal lives and into the homes, the quote-unquote castles of citizens, which I think, in a general sense, the Founding Fathers really, in terms of the Bill of Rights, would have abhorred.
Okay, caller, after all those years of getting tests from Dr. Lavine, now's your chance to ask a question. Do you have a question for our guest?
Well, no, just a comment, and it's good seeing her and hearing her wisdom once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have another caller standing by, Seattle, Washington. Go ahead, you're on the air. Seattle hung up on us. How do you like that? Let's get back to the issue of modern political philosophy. To what degree does the Declaration of Independence influence modern political thinking today, or has current political thinking really drifted away from some of the core concepts that were at play in 1776?
I think probably we haven't drifted away from it. I think one has to remember, for example, what Abraham Lincoln said. He said that every political idea that he had came from the Declaration and came from the concept of liberty there. And I think that that same feeling has perseverated. We have not lost that. I think that with regard to what the previous caller just said, and I'm very pleased that he is now going on to Harvard Divinity, I think that the Declaration for us is a sacred document. And I think that that sanctity of the Declaration of the Constitution, this is a form of religious feeling. This is a feeling that we have certain sacred truths that are embedded there. how do we gotten away from that? I think to some extent the emphasis in the Declaration upon the human individual, which was the big concept of the Enlightenment, to preserve the rights of each individual and to maintain that each human individual had political equality with everyone else. I think we have to some extent gotten away from that insofar as we have been dealing more and more with problems of groups, with problems of race, for example, with problems of ethnicity.
Is there a way, and maybe this is a terrible question, but is there a way of identifying some of the ideals that you just mentioned that were inherent in the Declaration of Independence as being closer to one of our major political parties than the other, or is that impossible to say?
Well, I think that, yes, I think it is. I think that for the most part, people who would be called conservatives are people who remain closer to the tenets of the Declaration than people who would see themselves as, say, left liberals or some kind of radicals, except for anarchists who want nothing except the individual. But for the most part, in terms of the major political configurations, I would say that what we would call conservatives today would be people who would be holding the same political views as Jefferson did in writing the Declaration.
Next call comes from Albany, New York. Good evening.
Good evening, Dr. Lavine. You are one gifted and articulate lady. I wonder if you could explain what I've been trying to understand for 20 years. What does the phrase dialectical materialism mean, and how is the word dialectical used? I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I have read for 20 years, and it makes no sense. Neither does the phrase the philosophy of history.
Okay, we'll take the first one, dialectical materialism, and Albany, you can stay on the line. If you have a follow-up question, we'll give you one.
Dialectical materialism is the name that's usually attributed to Marx's philosophy of history. That is, his understanding, his interpretation of the meaning of human history. And for Marx, what has primacy in reality is matter, but by that he meant not so much physical matter, but the economic underpinnings of society, the forms of production, the forms of economic production for any given society, which means working upon the soil, using the land, using tools and technology to make things, as he said, for us. And so this is the meaning of materialism for him. The meaning of dialectic is, of course, a concept that he gets from Hegel. And by dialectic, he means the movement of contradictions, the movement of opposition or polarity throughout history, from one pole to an extreme opposite pole, and then to a third position which attempts to synthesize the two and bring them together. And thus, Marx's view of history is, in the very large scale, a form of dialectical materialism, specifically as this, that the material economic mode of production began in the earliest days as one of some kind of primitive communism, a primitive sharing of the fruits of production. It moved eventually to production not by way of communal sharing, but for private property production, whether it was in Greece and Rome using slaves, or in the Middle Ages using serfs, or in capitalism using the proletariat or labor. These were the opposite poles. Primitive communism as a mode of production and private modes of production through capitalism. Finally, ultimately, the future, said Marx, and this was to come in the future, was to be a new form of economic production, a new form of materialism, which would unify the two. It would take from private production all of the achievements of advanced industrial production, but it would use advanced industrial production from the economy on behalf of the community, and thus communism would be the synthesis of the two, the dialectical unification of the two opposing pairs.
Now, Albany, wasn't that simple?
Actually, it was very, very clear, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you, and don't ask her to explain philosophy of history now, because we have another caller on the line. But thanks for your question. And next caller comes from Las Vegas, Nevada. Good evening, you're on the air.
Oh, good evening. This is John Peterson. I'm pleased to with your program this evening, and I have a question concerning the possibility of a constitutional convention. We're just a few state ratifications away from it, and many have pointed to this as a real threat or a danger, considering the conservative trend in government today. I think about this, but I also wonder whether there might be some real advantages in this age of mass population and the amount of wealth it takes to run for office. It seems to me that some changes in the Constitution might be really beneficial. I was wondering if you could spell out, as you see it, the dangers and the opportunities if such a convention should be called.
Well, I have not given a great deal of thought to this, but just simply off the top of my head, I would say that our Constitution, which in 1 year away we'll be celebrating the 200th anniversary of, that our Constitution has served us so well and is for us, along with the Declaration, one of the two founding sacred documents that holds us together as a people. I would say that it behooves us not to tamper with it. I don't think that one tampers with a sacred document. I think that insofar as one has problems with it, that one does what we have done in the past, that is to make amendments or to change things on the state level.
Some of you have seen programming where we were live from the National Press Club, not only National Press Club speeches, but for our morning call-in shows a while back. We did them all from the Press Club. Well, next week we will have another series of program to delve more deeply into what is the Press Club, who's there, and some of the major media institutions that live in the National Press Club. Monday, July 7th at 8:30 a.m. we will have a roundtable discussion with Alan Cromley of the Daily Oklahoman, George Embry of the Columbus Dispatch, and Benjamin Cole of Booth Newspapers. They are all Washington bureau chiefs for their organizations. Following that, at 10 a.m., we will have an interview with Bill Hickman, who is the president of the National Press Club Building Corporation, and that all is part of our look at the National Press Club next week. In the meantime, we have a caller standing by from Southport, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to open this question back up about this affirmative action decision that was made by the Supreme Court this week. I don't understand why I, as a 35-year-old man, should have to be discriminated against, in a sense, because of what you were talking about as slaves, or, you know, something that maybe my forefathers or maybe they didn't do. I come from a family of sharecroppers, okay? My grandfather sharecropped. The people who lived next door were black. You know, his father was a sharecropper. His father came from Ireland. But, you know, I don't understand why I, as an American, should, when I go to work for a company, the company says that they are making up for their mistakes, but they're making up for it at my expense. I don't understand that. I never have.
Okay, can you...
I think that what you're saying is expressing an important problem that affirmative action laws have created. I think that that we are looking here at a law or a set of statutes with regard to affirmative action that is seeking to solve a problem, namely to redress certain grievances from the past. And almost every attempt to solve a problem from the past creates new problems. And this is what you're expressing. You're expressing the fact that indeed it is the case that someone in your situation is going to suffer job discrimination because of the efforts of affirmative action. There's no question about that. The issue, however, comes down to one of long-range, fundamental national justice. And there seemed to be no other way of doing this except by way of instituting affirmative action, which in certain instances, not everywhere, but in certain instances, does in fact do an injustice to someone who himself had never discriminated against anyone, and that is the situation situation that you're talking about. I think that there are those that not only you, but certain other people who are minorities, who have come to this country, say only in the 20th century, find themselves also discriminated against by the effort of affirmative action, which has to do only with blacks and women and Hispanics, as you know. And so we are in a situation in which, unfortunately, and I think that one has to say this straight out, unfortunately, there is what is called reverse discrimination. But it is the price that we have to pay for the larger national issue which we're trying to solve.
We have less than 15 minutes left with our special guest, and if I can ask our callers for the rest of the show to try to keep to the issue of the Declaration of Independence and American political philosophy, and try not to get into too many current issues, which some of our other guests over the course of time on C-SPAN get into in a little more depth. Our next call comes from Davis, California. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yes, I have a question concerning your statement that the signers of the Declaration of Independence represented more a conservative philosophy. Would you say that is true for the time that they signed the Declaration or for today? It seems to say that they were of a more conservative bent.
Davis,
I find hard to take when you read the writings of Jefferson and you find our current policies quite adverse to many of the things.
If I could just make a quick point,
about, especially on the issues of religious freedom.
Davis, if I can make a point, I was the one who asked if there was one particular political party or political viewpoint that will be closest to some of the ideals or political philosophies in the Declaration. But why don't you answer that yourself and respond to the caller?
I did not mean to say, nor did I say, that the framers of the Declaration, the writer of the Declaration, Jefferson himself, was a conservative, not at all. In fact, he was, for his own time, seeking to bring about a revolutionary action against England, and there's nothing very conservative about that. What I was saying was, however, that today those people who are closest to a kind of Jeffersonian individualism are people that we would call today conservatives.
Next call, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yeah.
You're on the air, go ahead, please.
I can barely hear you.
Okay, we can hear you fine, just go ahead.
I want to go back to the comparison of Marxist versus American philosophy and suggest in passing almost that it is very dangerous to continually suggest, even though it's popular in Washington, that these philosophies are all that different. Your expert's defense or analysis of Marxism was in terms of conflict and oppressors versus oppressed. But of course that was the philosophy behind the American Revolution as well, and the Declaration of Independence, that we or certain people were being oppressed. I would suggest that Western philosophy's weakness here, this is not to defend Marxism at all, that Western philosophy's weakness is that basically it has been a philosophy confined historically to what rich white males do at leisure. This is true at least as far back as the Greeks, and it has had great difficulty being adapted to non-leisure time situations, as in a previous caller who talked about affirmative action and things of this sort. It is very dangerous to try to stretch it that far, especially, of course, since the philosophy that what rich white males do at leisure, among other things, is manage the government, was central, of course, to Jefferson's philosophy as well. So we have a very limited theory of liberty in the West, and we are having very great difficulty expanding it, and with respect to work situations, etc., or between 9 and 5, the whole world is really the same.
Pittsburgh, let's give our guest a chance to respond, and then if you like, we'll give you a follow-up. What's your reaction to that?
I think that that Western philosophy, perhaps in the time of Plato, was a philosophy expressing the interests of white males in their leisure activities, including running the government. I think that that after the time of Plato, this no longer became true. I think that Aristotle himself lived in poverty. I remember that Jefferson himself had to auction off all his possessions at his old age, and I think that your statement is, which is interesting, but is I think a kind of a play on words more than anything else. I would like to say, with regard to the important point that you made, that there is not that much difference between the Western liberal and the Marxist philosophy, that Western liberalism addressed the question of oppression too. From a philosophic point of view, the difference is that the philosophy of Western liberalism is not a philosophy that expresses conflict. It is a philosophy that expresses certain principles which resolve conflict. Whereas the Marxist philosophy is, in a sense, a much more powerful philosophy, because it is a philosophy that claims that conflict is in the very nature of reality, and that it has been in the nature of reality and will continue to be so until a kind of millennium, until the great day when a communism for all reality, for all human beings, will be restored. The power of Marxism is that it legitimates aggression and violence and hostility. It claims that these are legitimate against the oppressors. There is no such concept in Western liberalism.
What do you think, Pittsburgh?
The notion that the people who are oppressed cannot overthrow those who are oppressing them is not a part of Western liberalism. I had assumed all along that that was part of the Declaration of Independence. It justified a revolution. As to the rest of this, everything is relative. Relatively speaking, Jefferson was affluent, even though it cost him to manage public affairs a bit. And what I was quoting from was Jefferson's own philosophy. It is those of us who are well endowed by virtue of providence who owe it to the people to serve the public. And so the notion that we are all that different, I just don't see that. I'm getting an expression of Western liberalism that talks about peace and serenity after the revolution. But we are here celebrating, in terms of the Declaration of Independence, et cetera, we are celebrating a violent overthrow of government and should not forget that.
Thanks for the call. Any follow-up?
I would like to very much follow that up.
Sure.
In our philosophy, we have no element of conflict as being the nature of human reality or of human history. We do offer, because we have a philosophy of principles, we have a principle that must not be violated by government. That was the foundation of our seeking independence, our revolution from England. But the philosophic point is one of a principle that, if violated, gives those who have had the violation done to them a right to revolution. By contrast, in Marxism, the right to revolution exists throughout history, short of the coming of a total communist society. We live, according to Marxism, in conflictual relationships constantly. This is not true of Western liberalism.
Another call from Seattle. Are you on the air, Seattle?
On the air.
Okay, good. We had another one before that hung up. So was that you?
Yes, this is me from Seattle.
Okay, go ahead,
History
please.
teacher, and I was a little upset when I heard the doctor mention something about taxation without representation as a cause of the American Revolution. Surely she doesn't believe that. Hello?
Well, this was part of the rhetoric, as you know, with regard to the Boston Port Act and some of the other ways in which...
Remember that in the colonies, women were not allowed to vote, and only 3% of the adult males were qualified.
Right.
You have to be a property owner or wealthy to qualify for voting. And had they had the opportunity to send representatives to England and Parliament, they would have been outvoted all the time in regard to the taxation.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yes, of course. Of course.
And so it's a terrible myth for the Americans to believe that the American Revolution was caused by taxation without representation.
No, surely not. And as a matter of fact, not only that, but most of the rhetoric that was exhibited and pronounced during the Revolution was either a misrepresentation or misguided or an exaggeration. The simple fact of our Revolution was that under the pressure from the British administration of the colonies, the colonies began to take another look at themselves and to see for the first time that they could in fact be independent.
Before we take our last call, a quick reminder that every Sunday night we take a look ahead at the week's issues. This Sunday night, July 6th, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we will have Rick Swartz, president of the National Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Forum, and Richard Day, staff director and chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee on Immigration. They will be talking about the immigration reform bills currently in Congress. They'll be with you for 90 minutes, and we encourage you to join us. Our last call comes from Vienna, Virginia. Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes, very quickly. What would you say to the concept that in the East, you have certainly you have a historical forms of political absolutism that go back 3,000, 4,000 years, and during the Byzantine period, the doctrine of achieved perfection was the dominant political philosophy of that time. Later on, that tradition became convoluted, if you will. The sheep was pulled inside out, and it became the doctrine of the achievability of perfection. Whereas in the West, let's take the United States, we have a kind of system of collective empiricism. Can you say that perhaps the Turner thesis can be brought back, let's say, 1,500 years after the fall of the Roman Empire and work this way westward?
Okay, we only have a few seconds left. That's a big question, and let's get a quick answer on it.
Well, I think that the Turner thesis scarcely worked very well for this country, but to suppose that this has worked its way westward, I think would be such a huge speculation, needing so much evidence that I can't even think of what the evidence would be at the present time. Do you have a follow-up question for that?
I'm afraid we don't have time for one. I have a quick one for you in the few seconds we have left. Outside of getting a day off tomorrow, which most people have, why should people celebrate the 4th of July, and why should we be proud that we have a Declaration of Independence?
I think that we should celebrate it and be proud because the Declaration of Independence declares liberty as an inalienable right for all human beings, not just for us, but the whole world. And this is what the Statue of Liberty represents. It represents freedom for mankind. If anything on earth can be celebrated, aside from the celebration of a particular religion, if anything on earth can be celebrated in a purely secular human way, universal liberty surely takes our vote.
Dr. Thelma Lavine, professor of philosophy at George Mason University, thanks so much for joining us and making us know why we should celebrate tomorrow. To the rest of you, thanks for joining us tonight, and again, have a good 4th of July tomorrow. Good night.
If you'd like more information about this or any other C-SPAN program, please feel free to write to us at 400 North Capitol Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20001.